Franciszek shut his eyes in horror. And when he opened them again, the girl was gone. And Franciszek was somewhere else. Like a baby in its mother's womb, he tumbled a few times. Now he couldn't tell where the ground or the ceiling were. An invisible umbilical cord was pulling him on, saving or sending him to doom. Every moment, Franciszek could hear a life ending, now on the right, now on the left. Each time, it was the same dull, distinctive sound, like someone squishing cellophane balloons. All this time, Franciszek was silent, but suddenly, realizing that somewhere here, perhaps just a few meters away, his beloved was fighting for her life, he shouted, "Nastya, Nastya, where are you, Nastya?" Someone immediately responded to the cry and hit Franciszek in the temple. Franciszek wasn't the only one shouting, everyone was. They shouted so loudly that no one couldn't hear their own voice. They shouted even louder because every other person was deafened. They shouted with all their might as they fought. "Fucker, get your hands off me! My God, you animal! Morons, what are you doing? Fuck! Help! People!" Franciszek pushed against the ceiling of the passageway with both hands. The plaster clamped under his broken nails, while an unfathomable force continued to suck him deep into the human swamp. An unknown, alien, incomprehensible, dark, grey force sucked into where there was almost no air left. The oxygen was running out and ventilation was failing. One by one, boys and girls fainted, going from fighting for their own lives to being inane murder weapons. In a few minutes, the passageway was clogged like a drain. Human clog detergent had to be invented on the go. Up there, in front of the steps, people who realized what was happening tried to shout out to the unruly crowd of thousands, "Back, back, get the fuck back, it's a clusterfuck."
Thank you very much, Jochem ten Haaf, actor. This is an excerpt from Sasja Filipenko's fifth novel, The Ex-Zoon, the ex-zoon in het Nederlands. That was first published in 2014, but only recently translated into Dutch. The protagonist, after falling victim to a mass oppression in a subway station, slips into a coma. And when he wakes up after 10 years, his private life has, of course, completely changed. But the country, Belarus, is still more or less the same. We have the honor to welcome Sasja Filipenko today at the Balie. He is a Belarusian journalist, dissident, and author of 5 novels. And here as writer in residence in Amsterdam for a month. And next to me is sitting Franka Hummels, and she is an expert on Belarus and lived there for...
Not so long.
Stayed there for a long time, but you've been working on Belarus for about 20 years, I think?
Yes.
Lisa Weda, a writer, was gonna join us, but unfortunately she is ill. I'm Jante Mosselman, program editor here, and I'm really glad that you are here, probably for the last time in a really, really long time. And I'm glad that this last program that we'll be speaking about is this one that we're organizing is this one, because I think it's a very important subject. Sasja, thank you very much for being here today. I said a little bit about your book, but I was wondering, for you, what is it about?
Во-первых, добрый день.
A good day to start with.
Я очень рад быть здесь, и для меня большая привилегия быть здесь.
I'm very glad to be here. It's a great privilege for me to be amongst you.
Я рад, что мы заскакиваем на последний вагон в этом году, и вряд ли нам еще в ближайшее время удастся поговорить в открытых аудиториях.
It looks like we're getting on the last wagon of the last train when the decision by the government will be to have a full lockdown again. So it's good to meet at least for the last time in the open.
Поэтому я, конечно, буду рад поговорить обо всем, и о книге, и о ситуации в Беларуси, и о локдауне, и о том, что вообще целая страна живет в этом локдауне долгие-долгие годы.
And I will be glad to talk about my book and about the country, the things that are happening in Belarus, about the lockdown, because the country has been in lockdown for a very, very long time.
For how long would you say?
Это сложный вопрос. Я думаю, что все белорусы по-разному считают, когда началась эта кома и когда начался этот локдаун.
Difficult to say because Russians have different opinions about when this coma situation started.
Например, в моей семье, когда Лукашенко выиграл выборы в 1994 году, я помню, мне было сколько-то там лет, я помню фразу моих родителей, которые сказали, это катастрофа.
For myself, I remember that when he won the elections in 1994, I was still living with my family, and I remember my family saying, my parents saying, like, this is a disaster for the country.
В моей семье это понимали уже тогда, и я выходил, наверное, на первые марши, когда даже и не должен был туда еще выходить. Мне, наверное, было там 14-16 лет, когда мы с друзьями ходили на первые марши протестов.
And my parents were amongst the first to understand this, and I myself, I started participating in marches and protest meetings when I actually probably shouldn't be yet, since I was 14, 16 years when I started joining these demonstrations.
И я думаю, что многие белорусы долгое время старались не замечать то, что у власти диктатор, и многие белорусы старались жить какой-то параллельной жизнью, выстраивать семьи, как-то обустраивать свои дома, и пока их это вроде как не трогало, они готовы были мириться с тем, что... Ну, скорее всего, многие даже не понимали, что Лукашенко диктатор, это осознание ко многим пришло со временем.
Well, and I think that many Belarusians just didn't want to understand what was happening, and they tried to lead a parallel life, just living with their families, redecorating their homes, and taking care of things like that, just they shut off from what was actually happening. And perhaps there is Belarusians as well that just didn't realize what was happening, that there was a dictator around and that we were ruled by a dictator.
Например,
You said something very interesting. You said, I was going to demonstrations when I probably shouldn't be. Why shouldn't you be there at 14, 15, 16?
Ну, вроде как считается, что это еще рано, что ты должен ходить на демонстрации, наверное, когда ты получил паспорт, там, после 18, а не раньше, что ты еще ребенок, если у тебя нет паспорта.
Well, 14, 16, it depends on what you think, but isn't that a bit early? Shouldn't we start joining demonstrations when we have received our own separate passport when we were about 18? It's generally considered fairly young.
Я не знаю, как в Голландии, когда дети начинают ходить на демонстрации.
In Holland, when do children start demonstrating?
Franka?
I think it depends. Some at 15, yes. I think I went to my first demonstration when I was a baby. But it depends. People who are interested in politics at that age, they might join demonstrations. But of course, here, demonstrations just take time and nothing more. You don't lose anything by joining a demonstration. And that's a big difference from joining a demonstration in Belarus, I think.
Yeah, sure. Я думаю, что мой сын сейчас устраивает демонстрации уже в 9, но пока только дома.
My son is also organizing demonstrations at 9, but for the time being at home only.
Fighting authority.
Yeah.
You just described the state of Belarus as a lockdown, and in the book, the metaphor is of course a coma. And I was wondering, do you remember the first time that you thought of the country in this state?
Я думаю, что это ощущение приходило ко мне постепенно, со временем.
I think I started generally realizing this.
Но я помню, когда в 2003 году Лукашенко закрыл университет, в котором я учился. Это был Европейский гуманитарный университет. Я оказался на улице.
But I remember that Lukashenko closed the European Humanitarian University, so I was kicked out on the streets.
И я понял, что я не хочу оставаться в этой стране. Я впервые понял, что все здесь будет становиться все хуже и хуже.
And then I, for the first time, realized I didn't want to stay in this country because things would only be turning for the worse.
Я смотрел вокруг себя и видел, что людей интересуют какие-то исключительно материальные ценности, и все как-то занимались выживанием и обустраиванием, как я говорил. Я понимал, что в этой стране творчеству, культуре и свободе мысли на какое-то время, судя по всему, будет не место.
When I looked around, I saw that people were only concerned with material things to improve their own lives and their situation. And I understood that the culture and creative arts were not considered highly in the country, and that was for me a reason to decide for the time being to move.
Сама метафора комы точная, которую я почувствовал, что моя страна лежит в коме, она пришла ко мне в 2010 году после протестов, которые там принято называть площадью. Вот после этих протестов и их разгона, после такой неудавшейся революции 2010 года, которая на самом деле длилась, по-моему, там 3 минуты, когда мы были на площади, после этого там в течение нескольких дней я ощутил эту кому, в которой лежит страна.
And the metaphor that I use of a coma came to me in 2010 when there was a very short-lived revolution, so to say, 3-minute revolution, when there was these mass protests on the central square that were suppressed. And that was the moment when I thought, yes, this country is entering into a coma.
Thank you. Franka, I wanted to ask you, because you've been interested in Belarus for such a long time, why? Why this country?
Why I'm interested in Belarus? Well, it started quite in a maybe even childish way that I was in my first year of studying. A friend of mine did some months in university in St. Petersburg, and we went there by train, and we went through Belarus, and I realized I didn't even know this country existed. I felt ashamed because it was so nearby, so I went to the library and I read. This is kind of a stupid thing, but then I tried to inform myself. And then I was involved in the Dutch Union of Students, LSVB, and they had a partnership with the Belarusian Union of Students. Of course, it was forbidden shortly after ZBS, and we did a big project together, financed by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I went there to moderate seminars to talk about student self-governance, of course, in a very different reality from ours.
When was this?
This was 2000, year 2000. And then I made friends, so I came back shortly after, and we made a documentary movie about youth organizations in Belarus, so that's the first time I was there for several months. And then those friends really became friends and not just nice people you know abroad. And since then, I've been coming back and also reporting on Belarus.
When was the last time you went?
So a while ago already, because, well, I had some things going on in my personal life. So it must be 4 years ago now, or 5. Yeah. But I'm still in touch with people all the time.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to go with you both a bit to the present situation, because Sasha, your book was in 2021. Everyone said this book is prophetic. Why?
Мне кажется, это несложно. Если ты описываешь книгу о Беларуси, и это одна там, из вещей, которые я пытался показать в книге, несложно предсказать, что будет через 10 лет, потому что ничего не меняется.
Well, it's an interesting or difficult question, because the country is in a coma. It's not very difficult to prophetic. It's not very difficult to prophesy what the country will be like in 10 years.
И сейчас я разговаривал с моим другом, я говорю, я, наверное, хочу опять написать книгу о Беларуси. На что он мне сказал: зачем ты написал книгу о Беларуси, о событиях, которые сейчас происходят 7 лет назад, и она по-прежнему актуальна?
I said to a friend, I think I'm going to write a book about Belarus again, but then he said, why would you do that? I mean, you wrote a book already about it 7 years ago, and the situation has not changed at all.
И это, да, то есть, с одной стороны, я все время говорю, я очень рад, как писатель, что моя книга по-прежнему актуальна, и сейчас мы видим, что у нее какая-то вторая жизнь начинается, многие люди только сейчас о ней узнают, Но как гражданин я, конечно, очень опечален этим событием, тем, что книга, которая описывает какие-то совершенно ужасающие события, по-прежнему актуальна.
As a writer, of course, I'm happy that the situation hasn't changed, and my book is actually getting a second life because people are now there's new translations and more people are reading the book at the moment. So, as a writer, yeah, beautiful. But of course, as a person, it's a source of pain that our country is not moving forward at all. So, as a person, yeah, it's very sad.
И последнее, что я хотел добавить про предсказания.
And as far as your remark about the prophecy is concerned, I would like to add.
Мне казалось очень важным, что уже тогда я понимал, в какую сторону мы двигаемся. В книге есть момент, когда дети играют в разгон демонстрации, когда Франциск выходит во двор и видит, как дети, одни становятся ОМОНовцами, а другие становятся демонстрантами, которых разгоняют.
And some of the things I then wrote in the book were actually prophetic because, for instance, I have this scene where Francisc sees that outside, next to the apartment block, children are playing a new game, demonstration, and some of the children are playing the demonstrators, and other children are playing the riot police, and that is actually what.
Да, и это отрывок, за который меня критиковали в 2014 году условно либерально настроенные люди в Беларуси, которые говорили, что я сгущаю краски и что это невозможная сцена. Но мне казалось, что в 2014 году, когда ты понимаешь, в какую сторону поехал поезд и куда движется государство, для меня было очевидно, что однажды дети будут играть в эти игры, и сейчас мы видим в YouTube завален роликами, в которых дети играют в эти игры в Беларуси.
In 2014, people from what you would say the liberal elite said to me, well, you're painting a too dark painting here, your colors are too dark. But what do we see now? I mean, look at YouTube. YouTube is full of films where children are actually playing this game, demonstration game.
В общем, мне тогда в 2014 году хотелось показать, куда мы движемся, и, к сожалению, у меня не было иллюзий по поводу либерализации Беларуси, и я понимал, что однажды мы в этой точке ужасной, в которой сейчас находимся, окажемся.
And in 2014, I understood that since the train was moving in a certain direction, things would not improve, there would be no liberalization, and we would be in at this moment, at this point.
Thank you. Your friend said it hasn't changed. If you want to write another book about Belarus, why would you do that? Because the situation is still the same. Still, there is the metaphor of the awakening from the coma. And of course, I think especially, it was the first time that I saw these mass protests. Would you consider this a change or...
Я твердо убежден, что Беларусь вышла из комы и проснулась. Просто сейчас, спустя год после протестов, когда 400 тысяч человек покинули страну, мы видим, как Лукашенко и армия, и полиция пытаются сделать все, чтобы страна вернулась в эту кому форсированно.
Personally, I think that we got out of the coma. Yes, that's the change. On the other hand, nothing is. President Lukashenko, the army, the police, they're doing everything to get us back into this coma state. And in the meantime, 300,000 people have left the country. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Franka, when you saw the news of the mass demonstration coming out, you were here in the Netherlands. What did you think?
Well, I think that for me, I realized that change was going to come was when the elections were announced and there were 400,000 people waiting in line publicly during a pandemic to register for one specific candidate in the elections who didn't take part eventually. So many people spoke out, showed their position against the current president at that time. That was already a show that like something is really going to change, and that had to do with the pandemic as well, because before people felt that if they just shut their mouths, they were relatively safe, so they did not have their freedom of expression, but apart from that they could live a life. But then with the pandemic and government doing absolutely nothing except for denying the pandemic, they knew that they were not even safe when they let go of their rights, like their basic human rights, like freedom of expression, freedom of organization. So then people started to feel that they needed to organize themselves because government wasn't going to take care of them. So you saw crowdfunding programs for, like, for example, medical appliances or medical protection for people in hospitals and things like that. And it already started before the elections. And then also when the three women decided to run together and Tikhanovskaya was the main candidate, a lot of people voted for her. And that were people who might not have voted before. So for them it was actually the first time they experienced that their vote was stolen. So that was also like that they were protesting against their vote being stolen, their voice being stolen. So it was a build-up that already started in the spring of 2000, but that so many people were that brave to go on out on the streets, that's something that not many people had expected. I mean, that it would be protest, that was not a surprise anymore at that point, but that so many people joined the protest and dared to wear the white bracelets to show that they voted for Tikhanovskaya and publicly showed their disgust of Lukashenko. That was really something new. And I make this comparison in Dutch. The words for hope and despair are sisters. It's hope and wanhoop. And you need both to make a revolt. And despair, I mean, you're not going to risk everything, go out on the street, you might be arrested, but it might also mean that your parents or partner is going to be fired or even imprisoned as well. You don't risk that if you don't have hope for change. And these new candidates, they created this hope. On the other hand, despair, what I just said about not being able to be protected at all, their change was really needed. I mean, there was no way to live on without change, and otherwise you're also not going to risk everything to go out on the street if you don't, if you don't have to. And this combination just happened now. So it was this, that ignited this mass protests, I think. I mean, I don't know if you agree to this analysis.
Да, и я бы хотел еще только добавить, что я чувствовал разницу в 2010 году, когда я выходил на площадь, я понимал, что это малая часть общества, которая выходит, чтобы не сойти с ума и не поверить в то, что ты становишься частью диктатуры. Сейчас на улице вышла вся страна, абсолютно вся страна против Лукашенко.
Yeah, I agree. In 2010, it was just a small part of the population that had to protest in order not to get mad with this dictator. But now it was just the entire country that went out in the streets, onto the streets for the protest. I agree.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that, I think, is that after the protests were beating down so extremely violently, Lukashenko even had some people who actually voted for him turn against him because people felt like, you don't beat my son when he's doing nothing. So he even, with this extremely excessive violence against everyone, because, I mean, people who were not even demonstrating were taken from the street, put into minivans and brought to a prison to be tortured. I'm not exaggerating here, this really happened, and it happened a lot. That also meant for people that, it doesn't even matter if I'm going to demonstrate or not, because I can be brought to prison anyway. So, okay, then I'll express my opinion. So, I mean, after the elections, the mood against Lukashenko became even bigger. So more people even were against him afterwards.
Да, я полностью согласен. Я думаю, что просто многие люди, даже его сторонники, увидели настоящее лицо этой власти.
Yeah, I agree, because people now saw the real face of the authorities.
И это правда, что тебя могли арестовать не за то, что ты выходишь на акцию, а за то, что ты едешь на велосипеде, или за то, что у тебя майка. Например, лучший пример, который можно привести здесь, в Голландии, в Амстердаме. Если вы в Минске выйдете на улицу в майке амстердамского Аякса, вы будете немедленно арестованы, потому что она бело-красно-белая. Немедленно.
Yeah, it was not participating in a demonstration that would cause you to be arrested. Just being there, just cycling in the street, you could be arrested, especially if you wore the wrong T-shirt. I mean, to use a Dutch example here in Amsterdam, if you would walk in the T-shirt of the Ajax football team with the red and white colors in Minsk, you would have been arrested immediately. Just for wearing that.
Это не шутка. Моего отца задержала полиция, потому что у него был зимний шарф Мюнхенской Баварии бело-красный.
It's not a joke, because my father was arrested because he wore the Bayern München scarf in wintertime.
Yeah. And also those cases that people are arrested, but also people are actually sentenced after this, like this famous case of this white and red socks person who actually not just being arrested, but actually like receiving a sentence by, a judge, because we cannot see this as a proper legal system. So it's just, they even go on with this idea that you can take people's freedom because of wearing white and red.
Ну, мы должны понимать, что кроме этого, например, был случай, когда человека арестовали за то, что у него на балконе стояла коробка из-под телевизора LG, и она была бело-красно-белая. У него стояла просто коробка из-под телевизора, и его арестовали на 15 суток.
It's not a joke. I mean, there was this case that a man had bought a television set, LG television, and he put the box on the balcony, and the box was red and white in color, and he was arrested for 15 days.
What is keeping Lukashenko in power?
Я думаю, что Лукашенко настоящее политическое животное. Мы должны это признать, что он великое политическое животное.
Well, Lukashenko is a political animal, a very versatile political animal.
И в один момент, сейчас осенью, даже я поверил, что ему осталось всего несколько дней, когда его послали на 3 буквы на заводе, один из рабочих. Мы все поверили, что все, он поплыл.
Yeah. And this last autumn, I actually thought for a while that when he was at this, you remember, at this factory, one of the workers called him names. The Russians say there's a 3-letter word. Well, in Dutch it's a 3-letter word as well.
И нужно признать, что после этого он смог мобилизировать себя и начать шаг за шагом отстаивать, потому что он загнан в угол, и он понимает, что единственное его путешествие может быть в Гаагу, и он собрался и смог начать терроризировать целую страну. Терроризировать.
Yeah, well, he gradually came back, because at that time he was just cornered. He was in a corner and nowhere to go. He realized that the only option for him might even be being sent to the Hague Tribunal. So then he came back and with his terroristic means.
И нужно понимать, что мы находимся в ситуации, когда у нас есть точные подтверждения того, что выборы были фальсифицированы, и после этого люди, которые фальсифицировали выборы, должны быть арестованы. Но наша армия и наша полиция, которая должна была бы нас присягать, которая должна была бы нас защищать, присягает террористической группировке и выходит против людей.
And since people realized that elections had been falsified, the only option was to take the police and the army and by force and by terroristic actions get the people under the thumb again.
И, конечно, мы понимаем, что у него за спиной стоит Путин, у которого есть синдром Каддафи, который очень боится, что улица победит, и для Путина не так важно поддерживать Лукашенко, как важно не показать своему собственному российскому электорату, что, смотрите, улица может выиграть. Улица выиграла в Украине, улица выиграла, допустим, в Беларуси, и поэтому Путин постоянно подпитывает этот режим не для того, чтобы страна жила, а для того, чтобы он просто продолжал существовать вот в этих условиях.
And we also have to realize that Putin is standing behind Lukashenko. And Putin has, of course, this Gaddafi syndrome. If the streets are going to win, this might have serious repercussions for himself in Russia, and this is what he fears. So he's aiding Belarus and financing Belarus, but not to help the Belarusian people. It is just because he realizes that he will be in trouble when he does not.
Thank you. Franka, I'm going to look at you because could you say that the EU is also keeping Lukashenko in power?
Yes. Well, I'm going to give a geopolitical answer now, but I really think it's important to look at Belarus not only from the geopolitical angle, which is something that happens quite fast for EU, for example. You look at the migrant crisis, you look at this European plane from a European country to an EU country to another EU country that's grounded. But for example, like last week, Sergei Tikhanovskaya's husband received an 18-year sentence. And he has 2 young children. And we don't know what the future will bring, but they will not see their father until they're grown-ups, until they're adults. We're talking about like a very young girl here who has already not seen her father for 1.5 years. You cannot make a story like this geopolitical, and this is a famous case. There are many, many, many of those cases at the moment, like over 1,000 registered political prisoners, and probably much more because their families are told that they will get twice the sentence if they register as political prisoners. So it's really important to always look at the story of Belarus itself if you look at geopolitical questions. Now coming back to EU, so it's clear that Lukashenko is not supported by the Belarusian people. He did not win the elections. It's very likely Tikhanovskaya won. We cannot prove that because the evidence is destroyed, but we know that he did not win. Then Putin supports him, but it's not just Putin who needs to keep him in power. It's if the world around him sees Lukashenko as, well, again, this quotation marks, president of Belarus, because otherwise he's not president. His people doesn't see him like that. Russia does, in a way, and EU, officially in words, does not recognize him as president, but then again, you will see Merkel give him a phone call to talk about the migrants, in which she gives, at least admits that he has power, and also EU uses a lot of words and a lot of symbols, but doesn't really do much more because they know that if you attack Lukashenko, you also attack Putin. They would dare to attack Lukashenko. I have no doubt about that. But this is the implications of having a big problem with Russia is not something, it's not a road that the EU dares to go. And I'm not sure if I think that they should do that, but at least I think they should be transparent about that and not have this pretension show of being there for Belarusian human rights, because what they do is so little, it's so little and so late always.
I'm not 100% sure, but wasn't there an interview with him lately on
BBC? Yeah, but BBC is journalism. It's not like Merkel is was Bundeskanzlerin. So that was, well, the EU had an agreement that he is not president and should not be addressed as such. I'm making a phone call, so that's of course Merkel's phone call is more important.
It's more important, yeah. But still, I want to focus on that as well. What did you think of it?
The interview itself was very good, very, very good, very informed. You saw also Lukashenko, when you look at him, you saw, I think you can compare him to a dog who had his leg bitten off. So being very aggressive, but also not really in a proper position to fight. About the fact that he was interviewed, I'm not so sure. I think the way BBC did it was right, but I think, for example, CNN, they actually called him president, and I think we should be very, very, very careful with this kind of words. You can call him, for example, if I talk about him, I either use those quotation marks or I say the guy who calls himself president, because of course you have to use the word president in a way related to him, but never as him as a president, because he is not. And this is like a task for journalism also to be precise on that, because it also impacts the way people look at it. For example, also last week I pay money to Amnesty every month, and they send a letter in December asking for money. And this time, for example, they were asking money to help a Belarusian minor who is in jail. And the second sentence was, many people doubt if those elections were fair. And I was really extremely angry. It got me like this, because, I mean, okay, we have all governments except for Russia and Belarus saying that they were not fair. And then Amnesty of all organizations is like creating space for the fact that they might have been fair. And this is really something we need to be scrutinous as Europe. Really.
Да, я полностью согласен. И более того, я был очень зол, когда увидел, что несколько дней, недель назад посол Беларуси выступал в университете Лейдена, и название лекции было... Он развенчивал мифы про Беларусь и рассказывал, как на самом деле хорошо в Беларуси. И я не могу себе представить, чтобы в Амстердам Анны Франк пригласили нацистов, которые бы рассказывали, как хорошо живется Анне Франк в лагерях.
Yes, I fully agree. And I was extremely angry when I learned that the Belarusian ambassador had a talk at
second guy of the embassy.
Or the second secretary of the embassy had a talk at the Leiden University, and disproving some of the myths about Belarus and stating that Belarus was a wonderful country. It is as if, Anne Frank would be inviting the Nazis to tell how wonderful the Nazi system is to live under.
И, конечно, я думаю, что главная проблема заключается, с одной стороны, в России, в том, что Путин дает понять, что Беларусь — это часть России, сфера интересов, и когда Меркель или Макрон или кто-то пытаются решить конфликт в Беларуси, они звонят Путину. Это первая наша проблема.
Yeah, our first problem is, of course, that Belarus is considered by Russia to be its sphere of influence, Russian territory in a sense. So it's a very bad sign when Merkel or Macron, if they want to talk about Belarus, call Putin.
И вторая проблема в том, что интересы свободы в Беларуси заканчиваются для Европы тогда, когда начинаются финансовые интересы.
Yes, and the sympathy of Europe for Belarus and human rights ends when we talk about finance and economy.
Когда Райфайзенбанк понимает, что он может потерять деньги в Беларуси, ему становится неинтересно на права человека. Или компания А1 австрийская, когда она понимает, что может потерять деньги в Беларуси, им становится неинтересно. И множество примеров, когда европейцы пытаются отменить санкции, лоббировать отмену санкций, потому что это бьет по финансам. И сейчас для всех важнее Северный поток, чем санкции против Беларуси.
Yes, and for instance, if you take your Austrian Raiffeisenbank, as soon as they fear that they will lose finance, lose money through all this, they're not interested in human rights anymore.
А1 австрийская.
Yeah.
Да.
Yeah. Последнюю часть.
Последнюю часть я уже сам забыл.
Yeah?
So the only thing, well, what you mentioned, of course, is that what is interesting is Nord Stream and the gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe, and that is, when that is concerned, the rest is not interesting anymore.
И очень часто санкции, которые вводит Европа, они, первые несколько пакетов санкций, они скорее призваны, мне кажется, успокоить европейских граждан, чем действительно надавить на режим.
The sanctions that were introduced by the EU seem to be more for the own public to pacify the European population rather than to have a real effect on the situation in Belarus.
Например, когда каким-то белорусским чиновникам запрещают выезд в Париж или в ЕС, а мы видим, что они все равно потом туда ездят, это то же самое, что мне запретить ездить на Марс. Я никогда не поеду на Марс в ближайшее время. Это просто санкции ради санкций.
It's just sanctions for the sake of sanctions. I mean, a civil servant from Belarus will not travel to Paris. So, I mean, if you say you can't travel to Paris anymore, it's like forbidding me to travel to Mars. I'll never go there anyway.
Can I add something about the Dutch situation? For example, since the European Union slowly started with some kind of economic sanctions, actually the Dutch export volume to Belarus grew. I don't know the details because I haven't researched it, but it already shows like how weak the instrument of the current economic sanctions is. And I think now 3 weeks ago I wrote an opinion piece about this actually for NRC, because we have this idea in the European Union that sanctions mean that you do something, but sanctions actually mean that you don't do something. It means that you don't make money, don't make profit over human rights violations in Belarus. It means that you cut economic ties to make sure that you at least are not complicit in this. It means that you don't allow people who are criminals on your country soil. Sanctions, you need to do them. I'm definitely not against them, but you need to be aware that it's not the same as actually actively doing something. And I think that's a trap that European Union quickly falls into.
Да, я думаю, что, во-первых, мы видим, как сейчас в Литве разворачивается скандал вокруг поставок дальше Беларусь-Калия. Я думаю, очень важно для Европы начать понимать, что Беларусь — это не где-то далеко, что Беларусь — это часть Европы, что это такая же часть Европы, как Польша или как Венгрия, и мы видим, что как раз диктатура распространяется как ковид, ее нельзя закрыть в одной стране. Мы видим...
Well, you have the scandal in Lithuania with a certain company. Now, I think we have to realize that Belarus is part of Europe. It's, I mean, like Poland or Hungary, and always remember that dictatorships have a tendency, like COVID, to spread, and we see this at the moment happening, so we have to be careful.
И нам кажется, что можно задержать диктатуру в одной стране, сделать из Беларуси Северную Корею, как-то закрыть ее там. Но мы видим, как методы, которые использует Лукашенко, потом использует Путин, как эти же методы начинают работать в той же Польше. Например, моя переводчица Агнешка, когда переводила книгу про Кремль и про Путина, первые 100 страниц думала, что это книга про Польшу, потому что там не было никаких отличий. Там есть черные списки, там есть церковь, которая связана с неонацистами, запрет на аборт и так далее, и так далее.
Don't think that you can contain dictatorship. You see that the things that Lukashenko is introducing, for instance, in Belarus, the way he fights the opposition, is then copied in Russia or, for instance, in the Poland I just mentioned. I have a Polish translator, Agnieszka, and she read a book about the Kremlin, and she thought at first that, reading the first 100 pages, that the book was actually about Poland, because the exact same situation is starting to happen in Poland, also with the church and the Thai state church and all that sort of thing.
Например, там последнее, что я хотел добавить, например, когда я даю интервью в Польше, пока я критикую Россию и Беларусь, все остается, но когда я начинаю в интервью польской прессе критиковать то, что происходит в Польше, это вырезают сейчас, в 2021 году.
You know, we're living in 2021. When I give an interview to a Polish press representative, I mean, anything I say negative about Russia, of course, gets into the interview, but as soon, or Belarus, but as soon as I say something negative about Poland, it's cut out. It's not printed.
Thank you. I think this would be a good time in this subject to go to the second piece. So I'm going to ask Jochem ten Haaf to read the second bit from your book. And we're maybe it's good to say it. We're at the moment where Francisc is in a coma, and the Germans, where he used to spend a few weeks in the summer, they come to visit him.
Yep.
The German came to the bunk and took Francisc's hand. His wife stood behind. Grandmother was on the other side of the bed, and the guest asked something. Then he asked something again and again, and the girl started translating. He says, the German said, he says they weren't worried at first. Francisc rarely wrote. They thought it was okay and he had just disappeared as usual. And then they found out about the tragedy. This wasn't front-page news in Germany. Somebody had told them. They learned almost by accident. He says they were sure that if anything happened, you would definitely let them know. But then they did decide to call you, well, this shirt, he says he remembers this shirt. They bought it by the seaside. He is asking how it happened. We don't know for sure, grandmother said. They don't tell us any details. It seems to me, on the contrary, they are now trying to cover up all traces to hide the mistakes they made. All we know is that there was a concert. And suddenly it started raining and the crowd ran into the passageway and there was a stampede. That's all we know. How? Why? No one answers these questions. It was just a stampede, that's all. Actually, there's nothing to add. The girl again. But he's asking, why did you let him go there? And why shouldn't I have let him go? The grandmother said. How could I even know he would go there if he was supposed to be in the Lyceum? Tell those Germans they can keep an eye on their kids and stay out of other people's business. Yes, but he says that Francisc is like a son to him, that he's his child too. Well, tell him he's wrong. We appreciate their concern, but Francisc is my child and nobody else's. The girl didn't translate. She was only 20, but she heard stories like that more than once. When the big country fell apart, the West started helping children from the East. In the 90s, a huge number of Francisc's peers found new parents across the continent. Foreigners knew next to nothing about the young independent country. They only knew that there was a large nuclear power plant nearby and that one day this plant had exploded, which means that children needed help. Not only orphans, but also children from ordinary families received support. People who were called arch-enemies even 50 years after the end of the Second World War, they now opened foundations, transferred humanitarian aid and invited children to recreational holidays. Francisc never had any health problems, but on his first trip abroad he went like a child affected by radiation. It was called a family vacation. You opened a newspaper and saw an ad, recreational holidays in a German family, 3 weeks, $360. Sincere Germans had no idea that charitably paying even for flights of other people's children, they opened up a whole new page in the history of the young Eastern Republic's private enterprise. Sleeky fellow citizens started their own foundations and sent the children to holidays for a supposedly symbolic fee. To the Germans or anyone else, it didn't matter. Neither did it matter whether the children really needed healthcare or they were just from wealthy families. The main thing was to earn, immediately and as much as possible. Fantastic profitability attracted a huge number of fraudsters to the recreational holiday business. Ads offering to send a child on vacation appeared in newspapers every other day. They claimed it would be cheap and smooth. Children holidays with host families. 3 weeks abroad by bus. $500. So Francisc had spent every summer with the Germans since 1993. Eventually, without noticing it, the boys started saying, "My German mom and dad." Grandmother was very jealous, but she didn't reprehend her grandson, neither out loud, neither to herself.
Thank you, Jochem ten Haaf. Yeah, I think this is a fantastic fragment. Can you hear me? No, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah? But not on the... Yeah, it's back on. I think this is a fantastic fragment, but it's also really grim. It's really gripping in that way that it makes me depressed. And I think it has a lot of the things where you just spoke about in it. And I was wondering, how did you create this scene?
Во-первых, я сам был... Во-первых, я хочу сказать большое спасибо за прочтение отрывка и спасибо за вопросы.
Thank you very much for reading this excerpt, and thank you for this question.
Я был в такой ситуации, меня родители так отправили в Испанию. Я был в испанской семье.
I was in the same situation because my parents sent me to Spain, and I lived in a Spanish family.
И для меня это был очень важный отрывок. Я хотел показать, это как раз то, о чем мы сегодня говорим, как Европа помогает, как Европа хочет помогать, и как Европа часто не понимает, как все устроено внутри Беларуси, не понимает механизмов, и как она действительно должна помогать.
And for me, it is an important scene because this actually shows the way Belarus works and the system in Belarus works, and also it shows how Europe doesn't realize how the system works.
Потому что тогда, когда европейцы действительно хотели помогать белорусским детям, многие из детей, которые нуждались действительно в том, чтобы поехать в эти семьи и пройти, не попали в Европу, попали дети, родители которых могли заплатить за эти путевки, как мои родители тогда могли заплатить.
No, because the way the Europeans want to help, it's not actually the children that really need the help that are being sent, that are in a situation that they should be sent, but only the children whose parents have enough money to buy them these vacations. So, yeah.
И я помню, что многие испанцы, которые принимали нас, с ужасом поняли, что к ним приехали дети из семей, которые гораздо богаче, чем их семьи в Испании.
And these Spanish families, they found to their horror that the children from Belarus that were staying with them came from families actually richer than the Spanish families taking them in. И это один из примеров книги, в которых я показываю, как взаимодействуют, как и пример с получением визы через бронированное стекло, да, и пример, как посол общается с девушками. Это один из примеров того, как важно точно, четко подходить к помощи и как важно быть внутри страны, чтобы понимать механизмы, которые происходят внутри страны. And regarding providing assistance, it is important to be inside the country to understand how the country's workings. There's also this scene, with the how you get your visas, the talk with the consul through this the thick glass.
И в этом смысле я думаю, что многие европейцы по-прежнему не могут представить себе то, что происходит в Беларуси сейчас. Когда они не могут представить, они не очень могут понять, что они могут предпринять. Им кажется, что мы вот ввели санкции, вроде как они должны подействовать, и они не понимают, что они сталкиваются с совершенно другим обществом, с другой диктатурой. И для того, чтобы решить эту проблему, нужно глубже понимать страну.
Yeah, and it's just, I think that Europeans don't understand that this is not to any effect. They think, well, we've got these sanctions, so that should work on the system, on this country, on this dictatorship, but they just don't have enough knowledge and understanding of the inside situation in Belarus to see that this help is not effective.
I think it really beautifully captures both the ignorance and the arrogance of Western Europe. Franka, how do you listen to it?
Actually, for me, this is funny that this fragment is chosen because I wrote a book about the generation that were children when Chernobyl happened. It was published in 2011. And of course, it's not about cancer or about radiation as much because, well, it's 25 years after the disaster. It's more about a propaganda society in which everything about Chernobyl is kept secret. So people have to choose what to believe and have to find their own truth. And one of the topics, of course, is this Chernobyl children sent out into Europe. One of my main protagonists, she actually says that she owes everything to Chernobyl because she traveled Europe as a child, learned languages, learned that actually another system is possible. But for example, there's also a story about a program in a village, and that was stopped because the children went to, I forgot which country, I think Spain as well, that they started demanding game computers because the children didn't understand that the families they were sent to didn't have like an enormous tree that grew money in their backyards. So it's this total miscommunication. It is entirely in this well-meant idea of Chernobyl children, but on the other hand, it is important that those children were sent abroad. For example, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was one of those children. A lot of people have seen a different system because of this. So even if you help rich kids that have not suffered any radiation, you still affect the country in a quite amateurish, well-meant, not very effective way, but still it had an effect. And I think this is also a good moment maybe to say that the first fragment that was read about the stampede in the, at the metro station at a festival, that this actually happened in 1999. This is real. And it was also a way of government negligence that this was not prevented. So, I mean, this is, I don't think that all people in the audience know that this is actually real. So let's say that this Nyamiga disaster.
Да, мне хотелось вообще все, что происходит в книге, правда, и кома, и все, что я описываю.
And actually, everything that is in the book is the truth and is what happened.
Yeah.
И мне просто хотелось показать, как страна живет между этими двумя самыми большими трагедиями. Книга начинается с трагедии на Немиге и заканчивается трагедией со взрывом в метро. И мне хотелось показать, как общество вот проведет это время между двумя большими трагедиями.
And what I did in the book was to show how the country existed, what happened in the country from two tragedies, first the stampede at the metro and then the explosion in the metro, the beginning and the end of the book.
Yeah.
So that's what I had in mind, yes.
Yeah.
I can imagine that many people are not so happy that you are writing these things down. And I also read that the book, for instance, in Belarus is not sold on the shelves, but the bookstores have it secretly, and it was forbidden, you told me. And then, can you tell me about the YouTube with the writers reading it?
Сейчас очень сложно вообще. Я не могу понять, продается моя книга или не продается в Беларуси, потому что я не в Беларуси.
At the moment, it's difficult for me to know whether the book is actually sold in Belarus or not, because I'm not there anymore.
Мы знаем точно, что ею запретили пополнять фонды Национальной библиотеки.
But I do know for sure that the National Library was forbidden to take this book into its funds.
Мы знаем, что действительно в некоторых магазинах она есть, но ее не выставляют на полке.
And like you said, there is shops where it is sold, but not publicly, it's not on the shelves.
Yeah.
Есть некоторые магазины, в которых выставляют мои книги, в которых я критикую Россию, но не выставляют эту.
And there's bookshops that do have the books in which I criticize Russia, but not the books in which I criticize Belarus.
И, к сожалению, совсем грустная история случилась со спектаклем, потому что спектакль запретили даже репетировать, и актеры Свободного театра художественного были вынуждены уехать в Киев и смогли сыграть этот спектакль только в Украине.
One of the books was turned into a play. It was a rather sad story because the actors that were rehearsing the play were actually told that this could not take place. They had to continue the rehearsals and putting it on stage in Kiev.
И до этого, еще летом, до выборов, я придумал акцию, в которой известные актеры, политики, музыканты из России, из Беларуси читали отрывки из книги, потому что мне казалось важным перед выбором напомнить многим людям или рассказать многим людям, которые не знали о том, что происходит в Беларуси. И мне кажется, что у нас получилась хорошая акция, которая была замечена, когда многие очень известные люди читали эту книгу.
And I organized an action this was still before the elections, because I wanted people to know and understand what was happening in Belarus. I had organized this action where many famous people from Belarus and Russian and writers and actors and that sort of people, they read excerpts from this book. They read through the whole book.
Yeah. I want to speak a bit more about this, about the role of literature and art also in protest. Also because I read somewhere that there was one poet who said that she could not make any art because she was just too involved in protesting. So I was wondering, but because for you it has an important role, I think, in protesting and being outspoken. Can you elaborate on that?
У меня после 2020 года изменилось вообще, наверное, мое собственное мнение к тому, что я делаю.
Probably since 2020 I changed my attitude towards what I'm doing.
Потому что раньше я считал, что это сизифов труд, ты пишешь книги, которые все равно ни на что не влияют, но ты должен их писать.
First I thought it is, I don't know what that's in English, Sisyphus work, you know, an endless job which will never be finished. But now this has changed.
Потому что я получил письмо и узнал, что эту книгу читают в тюрьмах, и что люди читают ее вслух друг другу в камере, и что она поддерживает людей в тюрьме, и люди передают книгу из камеры в камеру.
And I thought that my books were to no effect, but then I learned that afterwards, I learned that in 2020 that my book was being read in prison by the inmates. They were reading it aloud, one to the other, so it did have an impact.
Yeah.
И мне моя жена Маша сказала, что, видишь, ты не имеешь права говорить, что книги ни на что не влияют. Если твоя книга поддерживает кого-то, то это, во-первых, вообще, как мне кажется, главная награда, о которой может мечтать каждый писатель. А во-вторых, это действительно, как мне кажется, важный документ, который там и для людей, если это важная поддержка, то теперь, конечно, я там изменил отношение к тому, что я делаю.
And my wife Masha told me, well, don't be too negative about your books, because if people read it and they feel reading your book supports them and helps them getting through, then your work does have an effect. Don't think that your work is your writing is having no effect.
И
And
сейчас...
that's how I started. Sorry, this is when I changed my attitude. I thought, no, it's more than just Sisyphus work.
И я понимаю, что, наверное, сейчас литература — это возможность вернуться к одной и той же теме несколько раз, когда ты работаешь как журналист, и ты видишь, что новость в конце дня умирает в ленте Фейсбука, и завтра уже никто не вспоминает о том, что ты писал. Если ты пишешь книгу, то это какая-то возможность возвращаться к одной и той же теме много раз, когда твою книгу переводят в разных странах, к этой теме постоянно возвращаются и возвращаются и возвращаются.
And a journalist knows that the news is very short-lived. So at the end of the day, you see the Facebook hits. You know, it's getting less and less and less. I think literature is a good way to return to a theme, to repeat it over and over again. I mean, your books are being translated, so the talks about your books, they come back. The theme returns. That's the privilege of literature, I think.
И, конечно, у меня есть художественные возможности, чтобы усилить какой-то эффект, чтобы донести мой взгляд или там, повернуть оптику на какие-то моменты, которые я не могу себе позволить в журналистике.
And of course, what you can't do in journalism is to, as a creative writer, you can just give certain effects, accents, use a different angle. Your optics are different than those of a journalist.
Thank you. Franka, I think it was the poet in your article who said that.
She did, yeah.
You wrote an article about literature in Belarusian literature in protest for the Nederlandse boekengids.
Yeah.
What struck you most?
Well, this woman you're referring to, at the moment she's not in Minsk anymore, she's in Kiev. And I'm not saying her name because she now wants to be a bit more off the radar.
Of course, yeah.
But she told me that she was too overwhelmed to actually keep on writing because it was too much, and literature has a very reflective character, and she did not have the headspace to be reflective because everything came over her. And she also said that she felt that literature, the reflective part of literature, that at the moment she was not providing the kind of literature the country needs. She saw that some poets that were not, when you look at literature standards, very good, like very motivating, very angry poets, poems, that they were very popular and widely shared, and that was actually what people needed. And she didn't disregard them, but it's just this other kind, more made by people like from the field, that actually made it that she was like felt that that was more needed at the moment. And there's an example of another a poet, and she wrote a diary about the first months after the elections. Yulia Timofeeva. Her book will be translated and published in spring this year in the Netherlands. And she normally writes in Belarusian language, but she wrote this diary in English because it gave her distance to what was happening, to at least, because otherwise it was too intense for her to find words and to actually make something that was understandable to, well, Western European readers. So you see this kind of, what I really saw to those people I spoke to for this article, and at the moment only one of them is still in Belarus, which also is, I think, shows a lot about the situation, but that they were really also, this total feeling of being overwhelmed, and I think that's not specifically for writers or other artists. I think that's the case for a lot of Belarusians at the moment.
Я только хотел бы добавить, что еще я вижу роль сейчас литературы, то, что я делаю в том, чтобы пытаться заглянуть в будущее и сейчас уже начинать обсуждать проблемы, которые к нам придут через 5-10 лет.
And to add, I think that literature is also giving us an opportunity to look forward. Where will we be? What will happen in 5-6 years?
То есть, условно, ту трагедию, которую мы сейчас переживаем, мне кажется, я осмыслил в 2014.
The tragedy that we saw in this year and was what I foresaw in 2014.
Сейчас я написал пьесу, которая должна была играться в России в Мариинском театре. К сожалению, ее сняли с постановки уже после репетиций, в которой происходит суд над врачом, который отказался лечить ОМОНовца, полицейского, да.
For instance, I wrote a theater play which was supposed to be staged in St. Petersburg, the main theater there. But after one rehearsal, it was taken off the list. This is a play about a doctor who refuses to medically assist one of the riot police members.
И в конце это судебный процесс, в котором судят врача. А в конце зрители в зале выносят ему приговор, голосуют, решают, виновен ли он в том, что отказался лечить ОМОНовца, или не виновен.
And it is in the form of a trial in court. And at the end of the play, the people in the room, in the theater, they have to decide, now, is he guilty for not medically assisting, helping the riot police, or is he not?
И самое ужасное то, что даже эту постановку, в которой, может быть, все зрители в зале решили бы, что да, этот врач виновен, и он обязан был лечить ОМОНовца, и осудили бы его, даже эту постановку сейчас не дают поставить, потому что общество и в России не готово обсуждать проблемы. Не общество, а власть, люди, которые держат власть, не готовы обсуждать эти проблемы.
And it's a sign on the wall that this play was forbidden because this shows that these dilemmas cannot be discussed. The authorities do not want these dilemmas to be discussed.
Потому что мы находимся в странах, где вообще не должно никаких обсуждений быть открытых.
Because we are now in a country where the process, the trial should not be open at all.
А для меня кажется очень важным, потому что нам придется склеивать страну, нам придется жить вместе с людьми, которые нас арестовывали, они никуда не уедут, нам придется жить вместе с людьми, которые нас пытали. И для меня эта постановка была очень важна ровно потому, что мне хочется сейчас уже думать о том, как мы будем наше общество потом склеивать. И я понимаю, что сейчас мы сталкиваемся с тем, что невозможно, вроде как ты еще не должен об этом думать.
And for me, this is very important because in one way or another, we'll have to stick the country together again. The people who were oppressed by the authorities, they will have to look their oppressors in the eye again. You have to move forward. But this just shows that the country is not willing to look forward, is not living up to this trial.
И, конечно, мне было очень важно показать гуманитарную катастрофу, в которой мы оказались, потому что я начал писать эту пьесу, когда услышал действительно от одного врача, который отказался лечить полицейского, Я спросил у него, почему, ведь вы давали клятву Гиппократа, и вам все равно говорить. И он сказал, что я обещал лечить людей, а не животных.
And the thing that I'm describing is in this play is something that had actually happened because I spoke to this, I heard about this doctor who was asked, why didn't you help this policeman? The background, of course, is that he has taken the oath of Hippocrates, so you should. But he said, okay, but this oath is about helping human beings and not animals.
И важно понимать, что мы в 2020-2021 году находимся в стране, где люди по-настоящему ненавидят друг друга, где есть настоящая ненависть и настоящая такая животное, это настоящая гражданская война, в которой мы сейчас находимся.
And we have to realize that we're now living in 2020, 2021, and the country is just a country full of hate, where people really intensely hate one another, consider the other people animals, and this is a very serious thing.
Can I ask you both, what would you have done if you were the doctor?
Я бы не хотел отвечать на этот вопрос.
Can I pass this question,
Yes, of
please?
course you can.
I'm also passing, but with a little bit more words. It's the same question, for example, that a lot of Dutch people say that they would protest Lukashenko if they were in Belarus. And the thing is, you don't know. If you've not been in the situation, you don't know if you're brave or not. You don't know what choices you make. You only know that when you're put on the spot. And I think the same goes for this doctor. I mean, I think morally it would be right to help anyone. But I can also imagine, I mean, if you help someone who's afterwards going to torture your kids, maybe you would not do that. I can quite understand, but I don't know what I would do. I'm not a doctor, I'm not there. And I like it that literature actually can put this perspectives forward without actually the judgment. So that's because that forces you as a reader or as someone who watches a play to really think and put a judgment there. So yeah.
Да, ровно это я и хотел сделать в пьесе. Я хотел сделать качели общества, чтобы, с одной стороны, этот врач вам чуть-чуть не нравится, с другой стороны, вы начинаете испытывать, узнавать, что этот ОМОНовец был хорошим парнем на самом деле, да, и ему не оказали помощь. С другой стороны, мы понимаем, что он был при этом зверем и избивал. И это те вопросы, которые все мы должны отвечать, и в конце есть там... Я бы хотел проголосовать в момент этой пьесы, чтобы она случилась. Не сейчас, когда невозможно, и когда мы понимаем, что мы эту пьесу сыграем в Вильнюсе, скорее всего.
And I also give not a fully black and white picture, but rather, you know, the scales. I mean, understanding also somewhat this right policeman, who is a good man on the one hand. On the other hand, he has done these wicked things. But just showing various sides of such a matter, and that passing judgment is not an easy thing. I wanted to do it at the end of this play, but it's not possible. But in the end, we're probably going to stage the play in Vilnius, so there will be a public verdict.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I wanted to ask you as well, both, if there's anything we haven't spoken of that you would like to, do you think it's important that is mentioned, please do.
Yeah.
My last question for you is, Sasha, because you told me that you just finished your next book, but then you also said it might be the last book that is going to come out with a Russian publisher because of what is in it. And I was wondering, because you live in exile, do you think it's worth it to keep doing it and to keep being outspoken? Is the cost not too high? Do you think about this?
Мне кажется, я стараюсь вообще уже сейчас ни про что не думать. Ни про что не думать. Я стараюсь...
I try not to think about anything at the moment.
Я стараюсь... Я работал над книгой над этой 3 года, и весь этот сложный год, за этот год я пожил в 4 странах, например.
I've been working on the last book you mentioned for 3 years, and the last year I've been living in 4 countries.
И я понимаю, что там в одной книге я говорю, что если ты не можешь помочь себе, попробуй помочь другим.
And in one of the books I say, if you can't help yourself, try and help other people.
И для меня литература и все темы, которые я поднимаю, меня это, безусловно, спасает, с одной стороны.
And literature and the themes I take up in my writing, they save me, they help me.
С другой стороны, там, конечно, после того, как книга закончена, и сейчас опять я чувствую себя очень пустым.
But now that the book is finished, I feel empty.
Я понимаю, что когда я пишу книгу, например, последнюю, как о первом директоре московского крематория с довольно чудовищными подробностями, которые я привожу в этой книге, которые нахожу в архивах, это, безусловно, влияет на меня, и это влияет, например, к сожалению, на мою семью.
And this last book is about the director of the first crematorium in Moscow, and it contains gruesome details that I write in the book and that I also found in the archives. This may have, it has an effect on my life and on if this is going to be published on me and my family.
И, например, когда мой сын, ему 9 лет, и он устраивает какую-то истерику из-за какой-то абсолютной ерунды, как мне кажется, я начинаю вдруг на него переносить и рассказывать ему, что как ты можешь из-за такой ерунды расстраиваться, вот были ужасные времена, а он просто 9-летний парень, который живет свою новую жизнь, и это его не касается, и я понимаю, что мне очень сложно отделить в процессе 3 года, когда, по сути, 3 года я живу и в Беларуси диктаторской, и еще в этот момент нахожусь в 1937 году головой, я очень резко могу реагировать на вещи, на которые не должен реагировать внутри семьи.
On a personal level, my son is 9-year-old, and he can get into a fit of hysterics over nothing at all, over a minor detail, you know. And then I can now react well, I mean, you're making a fuss over this, but you know what has happened in the past. Shall I tell you something really serious? So I've worked on this book for 3 years, and in Belarus as well, in a dictatorship. So my head gets full of it, and I should separate the two, the creative process, but it has taken such a lot of me. In my head, I'm both in the dictatorship of Belarus and in the great terror of Stalin in 37, 38, and it's for me difficult sometimes to separate my creative process from my family life, and that's not good.
Да, и поэтому... Все.
Thank you both. Was there something that we haven't touched upon that you want? Yeah?
I want to say something because I'm not optimistic about Belarus's future. But the last question often is, well, like, what can I do? Because it's so paralyzing to hear all this, and it might actually make people distant from the topic. Like, okay, it's out of our hands. We cannot do anything. And there is not much we can do, that's true, from the Netherlands, but there are some things we can do, and I want to say some of those things. For example, today at 2, just across the street here in Amsterdam at Leidseplein, there is a demonstration, solidarity demonstration organized by Diaspora. If you attend, you not only show your dislike of the regime, you also show your solidarity to diaspora and people in Belarus, that you are with them. That's one of the things. Another thing you can do is write letters to political prisoners. On polytech.me, there's also an English website. You can find everyone who's officially political prisoner. You find their addresses, their sentences, their stories. You can send them a short letter or maybe even some stickers so they can send stickers on the envelope for the letters to their children. You can send money through Bisol.org. It's an organization also created by Diaspora to support people who are in prison for political reasons and their families, because often the people who bring in the money are imprisoned. So those are examples of ways you can help and not passively sit down and be paralyzed by the massive problem that we have here at the border of our European Union in the heart of Europe. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Don't distance yourself from what's going on. You don't have to.
Thank you.
Я могу только поддержать эти слова, и я очень признателен за эти слова.
I cannot but support what you just said, and I'm very thankful for what you said.
Я думаю, что, с одной стороны, у нас есть ощущение, что все очень устали, и, конечно, всем бы хотелось, чтобы это поскорее закончилось.
On the one hand, everybody is just dead tired of it all and wants it to end.
И я в силу своей профессии вообще не оптимист.
And professionally, I'm not не оптимист.
Не оптимист.
I'm just never an optimist.
Но я понимаю, что мы на самом деле находимся в хорошем темпе. Прошел всего год, и невозможно очень быстро развернуть диктатуру, которая была 24 года.
But still, I think that we've reached a certain tempo, a certain development, and it's not. You cannot quickly remove a dictator that has been in power for 24 years.
И сейчас, конечно, мы находимся в какой-то такой яме. Но я твердо убежден в том, что мы не только должны делать все, что озвучено, но мы должны постоянно искать новые способы. Нам кажется, что мы сделали уже все, что можно, но мы должны искать новые способы давления на режим, потому что режим сейчас сражается не с белорусами, а со временем. Потому что он просто не соответствует времени уже.
Okay, we are experiencing a bit of a dip. And we think we have already used all instruments that we had at our disposal, but I think we have to find new ways to oppose the regime. And let's not forget that it's also a matter of time. This regime at this day and age cannot and should not exist.
Это как такая математическая задача, которую не могут решить десятилетиями, но потом находится парень, который все-таки решает ее.
And sometimes, it's a mathematical thing. You think for tens of years, for decades, that nothing is going to change, and then all of a sudden, somebody stands up, a guy stands up and does it, and it happens.
Поэтому, да, я думаю, что мы даже не вопрос того, что мы должны это делать, а того, что мы не имеем права этого не делать, пока наши друзья остаются в тюрьмах, пока тысячи людей остаются в тюрьмах. Мы должны, несмотря на усталость, каждый день придумывать какие-то новые способы давления на режим.
And I think we cannot just sit and do nothing, because our friends, thousands of our friends, are in prison. So it is our duty to find new ways to oppose the regime and do something.
Thank you both very much. I'm going to ask Jochem ten Haaf if he wants to read the last fragment out of your book.
Okay.
And if you think of a question, in the meantime, that would be great. You don't have to, but there's a little bit of room after Jochem has read.
Will you set the scene? Maybe that's a good idea. I think
You
it's
do it.
I think it's a discussion. If I'm right, it's a discussion between two of his teachers at the Lyceum, right?
Yeah.
So one of them starts. While listening to everything here, I understood one thing. Many forget that we are a music lyceum, first of all. We're training musicians. That's our speciality, so to speak. So what can we say about Lukic as a musician? Does he have talent for music? Will he ever make a living playing the cello? Will music be his source of income? No way. That's something we should begin with. Now let's talk about his professional skills. What are they? What can he impress us with? Does he have a perfect pitch? Lukic does not. I would say he has no pitch. He's deaf. He always gets D's in solfeggio. His hands are out of sync, He can't conduct with one hand, play with the other, and simultaneously sing. We shouldn't keep the children who can't write a simple one-voice dictation. So, moving on. How is his piano class going? Did you hear him play? It's good if he can play with two hands at an exam, and he missed class for months. And last but not least, his major. Will Lukic be a good, skilled cellist? Will he be able to study in the conservatory, to sit in the orchestra pit? Absolutely not. It's already hard for him to keep up with the program. He is an outsider. So what do you suggest? Keep dragging him so he can end up in the double bass class? Pity the double bass teachers. What did they do to you? Why do you foredoom them to put up with lazy students? If kids don't want to do anything, if they don't like music, Why do we transfer them to tuba or double bass? Music doesn't tolerate slackers. Work, work, and work. That's what's important. And Lukic doesn't know the meaning of the word. If he's good at literature or history, I'm very happy for him. But once again, I want to remind you, we are preparing musicians, not bowlers or blotters. So, how many have you prepared yet? How many who? Musicians. Oh, no non-science, Valery Semenovich. You know very well that half of the conservatory graduated from our lyceum. Yes, and what's next for them? What do they become, your graduates? Selling office supplies? Third violin in the opera house? Any soloists? Any names? Who made our lyceum famous? It's over 30 years, and have you prepared any real musicians? Who makes us proud? Can you tell me a name of any graduate that's in the papers? Don't remember? I'll remind you. The namesake of a great poet. Do you remember what he became famous for? He dumped manure in front of the president's residence and pierced the president's portrait with a pitchfork. That's it! That is the person our lyceum is associated with. You have done nothing with your dictations and resolutions from dominant court to slash court. It is high time you recognized that you are not preparing musicians, but watchmen and art janitors. Personnel for the president's orchestra meeting third world countries' ambassadors. Let's teach them basic things. How to think, doubt, ask questions, and not to accompany third-rate singers at Slaviansky Sham. Well, friends, we can go very far if we don't stop. I'm urging you to calm down and behave yourselves. It's the end of the year, and we're obviously all very tired. Summer is around the corner. We'll get some rest and soon begin a new year and a new fight, so to speak. Valery Semenovich, you are, of course, talking about important things, but unfortunately off topic. We all know that musicians and artists graduating our lyceum are, well, qualified. Boys play the tuba, girls can draw a landscape, no smear, no complaints from the state. They wanted to shut us down and open a police academy here, but then the state decided that we are important too. We shouldn't question the success of our music department. We have a lot of credentials, diplomas, so why don't we proceed? We have 12 more students to discuss, so I suppose the Lukic case is closed. Excluded.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jochem ten Haaf. Thank you very much, Jochem ten Haaf. Is there someone who would like to ask a question?
First of all, thank you very much, Sasha, for your book. I read it like 4 years ago when I was living already in Netherlands. I read it in Russian. Дякую великий. And I felt that this book is about my generation. It's about my Minsk. Of course, I knew tragedy at Nemiga. Of course, I knew... Actually, I was understanding fully what you were saying in that book. I understand your allegory about the coma, but I felt that this book more about Minsk, about my generation, about my friends. And I was thinking, okay, back then we've been pretty much nationalists. And we've been, when I was in school, when I was first years in the university living in Minsk, I felt like I was more like libertarian, more right-wing. Over years, I started feeling that I was changing. And when I read your last play, Tikhari, if I'm not mistaken, I read it in the Russian journal over the cinema. And I started feeling that, oh, probably Sasha also was changing throughout the years. And probably Sasha was like all my friends in the end of 90s, we almost the same age. We've been more like red-wing guys, and now living in Europe, in a good sense, like we have not been like racists, right? But we've been like patriotic in patriotic mood. Now I feel like I'm too far in the left wing, right? And when I reading your play, I felt the same. So the question is, do you feel that, first of all, am I right about you? And do you feel that in Belarus, people who was on streets in 2020s, they are still in that mood of beginning of 2000? And I'm very, grateful. I feel very good that you thinking that in 10 years, when this trial will happen over this doctor, people probably will change. And they will become less nationalistic. Do you agree with that? Yeah.
Спасибо большое за вопрос. Мне сложно про себя понять, меняюсь я или нет. Мне кажется, ответить на этот вопрос могут только люди вокруг меня.
For me, it's difficult to say whether I have changed over years. It's for the people around me to judge.
Мне все время кажется, что я все тот же парень, который спорил когда-то в туалете, как Франциско, политики.
In a sense, I can still consider myself the boy that was in the toilet discussing, like Francis, discussing politics in the toilets, school toilets.
Наверное, я стал в каких-то вещах не столь категоричный, как был раньше.
Perhaps in certain respects, my opinions are not as categoric as they used to be.
С другой стороны, мне кажется, что все равно я часто использую какие-то категоричные крайние меры протеста.
But on the other hand, I still use sometimes very categoric forms, very definite forms of protest.
Остаюсь ли я тем же бело-красно-белым парнем, которым был тогда, мне кажется, да.
Whether I will remain this red and white guy, I think yes.
Другое дело, что есть много вопросов, которые я, наверное, готов теперь дольше и глубже обсуждать, чем 10 лет назад.
But there's definitely many themes that I would talk about more deeply now than I would have done 10 years ago.
Я не знаю, точно ли я ответил на вопрос, но как-то так я себя чувствую, да.
I don't know whether this is quite the answer you expected or whether I've sufficiently answered your question.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. No. Yes.
I see a few. I'll come towards you.
Yeah, thanks first of all of you for joining on the podium today. I have a question for both of you actually, because you mentioned that you were not fully satisfied with the sanctions and that this is not enough. You mentioned also, of course, that there's a responsibility to journalists in the wording when they refer to Lukashenko and all of this. But aside from that, what would be like a concrete step from Western states and leaders you would like to see in terms of actions towards Belarus to, effectively help the situation there?
Yeah, okay, I'll go first. And my answer is that I don't know exactly, but the first thing that I want from Europe is to be honest about what Europe is willing to do and what Europe is actually doing. Because at the moment, the words and the actions of the European Union don't match. So that's like the first thing to do. I mean, if they don't want to risk war with Putin, it's not to me to judge about that, but at least be honest about this. And the other thing that I think that can be done on a national level or even municipal level in all European countries is help Belarusians that need to get out of their country. Assist them in getting political asylum. Get them out of the country even. Help with that. Don't make it extra hard. Try to create spaces in which Belarusians can rest for a while. People who are fighting in Belarus, it really drains them to make sure that they are at least can take a break from this. Make sure that you support Belarusian media, for example. If all free media in Belarus are closed, they're in exile. Support them financially, support them logistically. Make sure that the Belarusian civil society can go on in exile. And at the moment, this sounds very simple and it sounds very logical. You will probably think, of course, but at the moment this is not happening. I would say the opposite is happening. So that's like a concrete thing that Europe can do and should do and also is not doing. So that's another thing that I would want from European Union.
Я думаю, со своей стороны, что, во-первых, санкции, которые введены, они по-прежнему, многие не начали действовать, а многие очень быстро поняли, как можно обмануть. Они не действуют так, как должны были действовать, это первое.
Many of the sanctions that have been instituted will only start working in the course of time, and other sanctions are not being, what would you say, people try and find ways around the sanctions, and that is actually happening too.
Второе, не прошло настоящей делегитимизации режима Лукашенко. Многие страны не признали его победу на выборах, но, в общем-то, считают его таким полулегитимным президентом, с которым можно как-то там через посредников неофициально взаимодействовать как-то. Многие газеты и журналисты по-прежнему называют его президентом, хотя везде должны называть его узурпатором.
And another thing we could do is, you see that many countries, though they have not officially recognized Lukashenko, they still tend to address him as a president or half a president. And the journalists in the press, it is the same thing. So that is one other thing that should stop.
Например, я твердо убежден в том, что не нужно ждать ареста Лукашенко для того, чтобы начать трибунал. Трибунал по преступлениям, которые произошли в Беларуси, можно и нужно начинать уже прямо сейчас, потому что есть все свидетельства, есть доказательства, есть свидетели, к счастью, которые выехали. Уже прямо сейчас мог бы начаться трибунал, который серьезно повлиял бы на то, что происходит в Беларуси.
And we don't have to wait with this tribunal until Lukashenko has been arrested. He can already be trialed. The tribunal in The Hague could already start and try and see what crimes he has committed. There's evidence. There's people who can witness. So there's no reason why this couldn't start, and that would have an enormous influence on the situation in the country.
I want to add something to this, that actually Netherlands has agreed to pay for the collection of evidence. So that's at least something that the Netherlands has done.
И более того, например, большая ошибка, которую совершают журналисты, когда описывают ситуацию в Беларуси, говорят, что 40 тысяч человек прошли через тюрьмы и 3 тысячи человек подверглись пыткам. Но это неверно, потому что любой человек, который оказался в белорусской тюрьме даже на 15 суток, подвергся пыткам. И мы должны говорить о том, что 40 тысяч человек прошли через пытки.
And another thing which is wrong, I think, is that journalists say things like, well, okay, there was 40,000 people arrested and held in prison, but only 3,000 were tortured. That's not true. Anybody who was 15 days in prison was tortured, in fact. Что-то пропустил?
Нет, все супер.
That's okay. There's one last question.
Yeah.
Okay. Sasha, thank you for being here and your story, your answers, and Franka as well. I'm a little bit in doubt because it's a completely different question, but I'll ask it anyway. In Russia, the writers were called the conscience of the nation. Are there classical writers or contemporary writers that you are influenced by or that you admire?
Я не очень понял. Не очень слышал последнее.
Есть классические писатели, которые я
Да, я не услышал последнее. Это сложный вопрос, потому что я, во-первых, в школе вообще ничего не читал, потому что у нас была ужасная учительница русской литературы, и было тонуть веселее, чем ее слушать.
Well, a difficult question, because I must confess that I didn't read anything in school. The Russian teacher, Russian literature teacher, was, we would rather drown her than listen to her lessons.
И в школе меня воспитала музыка, потому что я учился в музыкальном лицее, и первой литературой, которая на меня повлияла, это был Рахманинов, Моцарт, Бах, Шостакович, и меня как-то долгие годы воспитывала музыка.
And since I was studying on a musical lyceum, my literature was actually music, so like Rachmaninoff and Mozart and Bach, and that was my literature, the music.
А потом, когда я начал усиленно читать в университете, я 6 лет занимался изучением исключительно литературы и в бакалавриате, и в магистратуре, и в этом смысле мне сложно выделить уже каких-то авторов, потому что их вдруг на меня обвалились сотни, и я могу очень долго рассказывать об авторах, которые на меня повлияли. Я думаю, что это все эти годы изучения литературы французской, русской, итальянской.
And then when I started studying and finished my university, got my university degree, 6 years I did a lot of reading, a lot of studying of literature. I think hundreds of authors came by. I studied Russian, Italian, Spanish literature. We can talk for hours on this, but it's hard to pinpoint specific writers.
Я там у писателей всегда спрашивают, какие 3 книги вы бы взяли с собой на необитаемый остров. Я все время думаю про то, что я бы скорее взял бы, наверное, чистые тетрадки.
You know, they often ask writers, when you have to sit on an uninhabited island, what book would you take along? I would rather say I'll take an empty notebook with me.
Но я, конечно, могу назвать много авторов, которые на меня повлияли, если это нужно.
But if necessary, I can mention several authors that were an influence on me.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much for being here. Thank you for translating. Thank you, Jochem ten Haaf, for reading. Thank you very much for being here today. As I said in the beginning, probably one of the last times that we are here together. I hope it doesn't take long, because I think it's very important to keep speaking with each other and with people in these halls about these subjects. So let's hope for the best, and let's hope we can gather again soon. Thank you very much. It's been an honor having you. And see you soon, I hope.
Yeah.